So looking at some examples now, I've taken these from glycemicindex.com, which has a searchable database, and also in part from this other site that has everything kind of at a glance. Might be interesting for you just to get a general feel. But one thing for sure, the guidelines you often hear about with respects to the glycemic index is that you're supposed to target medium or low GI values, but as we'll see in a bit, this is not good enough as a guideline. So in any case, where does 100 come from? The reference point of 100 is glucose in water. So if you drink glucose in water, you can be sure that that's going to hit your bloodstream as fast as you can imagine. And that's 100. So if we compare it to some other sugars, fructose gives you a value of 12. This should make apparent the fact that it's just not showing up. Fructose gets converted directly into glycogen and fat, and so it doesn't get converted to glucose before being converted into glycogen. So it's extremely misleading. And the same is true for sucrose, because sucrose, which you find in fruit, but also in a lot of, well, actually largely in fruit, but in some sweets, is a disaccharide of fructose and glucose. And although it does need to be split in half before we can absorb those sugars, is the 58 here because of the fact that it took more than 2 hours to break them down? No, it's because half of the sugar is fructose, which just doesn't show up in the glycemic index. So glucose, as we said, is 100 by definition. White bread, interestingly, is 100 as well. And this should give you an idea of just how efficient the stomach's enzymes are in breaking down starch. And so but this is an example of where the glycemic index is very useful, because you don't have to be eating white bread. You can pick other kinds of bread, and you should use the glycemic index to find bread that you find appetizing and pleasant to eat, but that doesn't get digested so fast. And so whole wheat and so on really makes a huge difference. So comparing fruit, though, in general, the glycemic index, I think the way that it should be used is to compare starch against starch and fruit against fruit and so on, and to really be careful with food that has a lot of fructose. So Coke and chocolate bars, chocolate bar gives you a low GI value. Does that mean it's something you should be eating? No. The reason it's so low is because chocolate bars are rich in high fructose corn syrup, and so a lot of the sugar that's in there just is not visible and gives you completely misleading results. So in any case, getting back to fruit and vegetables, the one thing to be aware of with plants is that the cell wall in a plant is made of fiber, those long chains of sugar that we can't digest, and it's those cell walls that are the #1 way to slow down digestion and to make sure that the sugars are slow. So although fruit are sweet tasting, because our teeth are able to break down those cell walls pretty easily and to release the sugar, the enzymes that we have in the stomach are not able to break down those sugars. And so, but removing the water from plants generally tends to completely destroy their cell walls. Conversely, animal cells, which are made of out of fat, can survive dehydration very well because they're soft. The hard sugars that make up the cell walls in plants, however, generally don't survive quite so well, and you really notice when you're eating rehydrated food. So so looking at grapes versus raisins, it's interesting to see how grapes have a glycemic index that's a fair bit lower than raisins. And I think the one thing to notice about raisins, though, too, is just that they're much denser. It's easy to eat 10 raisins in one gulp, and you don't really notice that you've eaten so much. But once it hits the stomach, it basically gets digested very, very quickly. So, but what's interesting though, again, and this is where the glycemic index is so neat, when you compare against with how apricots are dried apricots have a very low glycemic index, and much lower than the fresh apricots. And so you can kind of this fits with the experience of eating them. Dried apricots are kind of chewier and not quite as sweet as raisins, for example. Maybe they make a good alternative for a snack. If you're looking for something that's easy to carry and that'll give you some slowly digested sugar. Now, apples give a range of 28 to 44 from what I saw. The apple juice has a range that's pretty close, but does this mean that you should be drinking apple juice? In my opinion, it's a definite no, because you've removed, you've released all of the nutrients basically when you've turned it into juice, and the experience of drinking juice. An apple will stick with you for quite a while after you've eaten it, whereas juice, it's just not the same. So I'm not sure why the value here is so low. I think it might be, I mean, it could be from any number of things, but it being low is not enough of a reason for me to consider taking that as nutrients. So in perspective, most vegetables are around 15, and indeed, vegetables have nutrients that are so hard to reach that they don't get released in the stomach very much. It's only once you've gotten the help of all the bacteria in the intestines that we're actually able to break those open and get access to all of that. So as an example of how you might want to use the glycemic index, if you're making pasta, you have the choice of what kind of noodles to use. And there's a really wide range, and it's not always obvious. So protein-enriched spaghetti has an amazingly low value. Regular durum wheat spaghetti has a pretty good value, 55. And rice pasta, made from brown rice, has a very high glycemic index. So, so the glycemic index, take a look at the database and get a sense for how you can swap, and make small changes where you can pick any pasta you want. Try to pick one that you find is appetizing, but gets digested slowly. So we've been talking about how having the cells in the fruit and vegetable be intact is the best way to slow down the absorption of food. And so evidently, if you grind food down, if you cook it for hours on end, you destroy the cell walls, and you free all the nutrients. Hydrating or dehydrating and rehydrating food obviously also is another approach. But in general, trust your taste buds. If the food tastes sweet, then it is sweet. But also be careful in how you read labels, in that people are avoiding labels like sugar and high fructose corn syrup and so on. And so manufacturers are using different sources for kind of the same result. If you have, say, tomatoes as one of the primary ingredients in what you're eating, that doesn't mean really a whole lot as far as the nutrition quality is concerned. If those tomatoes were pureed, cooked, and strained, and so on, ketchup, for example, which does have sugar added to it in addition to the tomatoes, it is sweet 100%. There's nothing holding back that sugar, and therefore that's why it's bad for the sugar reaction that it causes and fattening in general.